Fusion Mobile, quality e-learning experience on the go.
Hello again and welcome to Fusion Mobile e-learning in class. As always, my name is Abubakar Abdul and here we are talking civic education. In this video, we are going to be looking at the topic democracy and the rule of law. We'll be looking at the meaning of democracy and the rule of law. We'll be looking at the advantages of democracy, problems of democracy, democratic process, limitation of rule of law, importance of rule of law, process of rule of law, and then the problems of rule of law. Basically, these are what we'll be looking at in this video. So the first on our list is the meaning of democracy and rule of law. So democracy is a system of government where the will of the majority of the people in a political setting predominates. Where the will of the majority of people in a political setting predominate. Is a situation where people elect their representatives, the majority, the bigger number elect who they want to represent them. Basically, that's what democracy is. Putting it plain and straight, as Adam Lincoln has defined it, democracy is government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Well, you know that definition. But then again, basically, democracy is a system of government where the will of the majority of people in a political setting predominates. The will of the majority of people in a political setting predominates. And then when you're talking about the rule of law, when you're talking about the rule of law, of course you're talking about law, and then you're talking about rule. It's a situation where the law rules. The law is supreme. It's a situation where government subjects its citizen to the provisions of the law. It means as long as you're a citizen of Nigeria, you are beneath all the laws in Nigeria. If it's a law, you are beneath it. If you commit a crime, you are answerable to the law. No one is above the law. That's basically what the idea of rule of law says. Everybody is equal, and anybody who commits a crime must be punished. That's basically the idea of rule of law. So now let us talk about the advantages of democracy. Now we've looked at the meaning of democracy and we've seen the meaning of rule of law. So now, what are the advantages, importance of democracy in our nation or in our country? Number one, democracy provides easy means of governing people, even when they emerge from diverse cultural orientations like Nigeria. Number two, it allows for the election or selection of best hands and brains in governance. Number three, democracy ensures the maintenance of law and order, which is one of the major responsibilities of government. Number four, it makes the masses the sole determinants of government actions and activities through their mandates. Number five, democracy reduces the incidence of sit-tight syndrome, noticeable in dictatorship and militarized states. Number six, it is an acceptable yardstick to measure contemporary government and improvement in nations' economies. Number seven, it gives room for active participation by masses and feeling in government by encouraging obedience and sense of patriotism. Number eight, it gives smooth, even and less acrimonious means of change in government. Number nine, it allows everybody his opinion and through this way discourages oppression and marginalization. And then finally, democracy entrenches the principle of separation of power, checks and balances, which makes government forthright, focused, responsive, responsible, and answerable to public court. All this mentioned are the advantages of democracy. This is why we should practice democracy. This is why we should encourage democratic activities in our country, in our society, in our environment. Now, since we've looked at the advantages of democracy, you might wonder, what are the problems of democracy in Nigeria or in anywhere? What are the problems of democracy? And now we're going to highlight some of the problem of democracy, or disadvantage of democracy, if you may. Number one, democracy gives more importance to quality rather than quantity. Number two, principles of equality promoted by democracy are undoubtedly unnatural. Number three, democracy makes government and governance expensive. Number four, it is obviously the dictatorship of the majority. Number five, there is the experience of the bad effects of political parties. Number six, democracy allows only few to become professional politicians. Number seven, democracy portends a weak government. Number eight, certain behavioral attributes affect the smooth sailing of democracy. Number nine, poverty and living below well-being. And then finally, number 10, another setback of democracy is lack of development and infrastructural facilities. All these are some of the problems, disadvantages of democracy in our society. Now, since we've looked at the advantages of democracy and we've seen the disadvantages of democracy, now indulge me, let us look at the democratic process, the process by which, step by step, things that need to be in place for us to say, okay, you know what, this is a democratic process, this is complete, this is democracy, this is true democracy. But first, a question is going to pop up on your screen, and I hope you are going to answer the question correctly. Here's the question. Welcome back from that, and I hope you answered that question correctly. Before the question popped up, I was saying that we are going to look at the democratic process step by step. We're going to look at the democratic process that we have, that we actually observe. Number first is popular consensus. The masses within a defined territory must consent or agree to have democratic culture, state institutions, and government. Number two, appointment of a constitution drafting committee. It is usual to practice it is usually a practice to appoint eminent persons versed in legal and democratic practice to come together to suggest constitutional provisions. Number three, constituting a constituent assembly. Number four, ratification and adoption of the drafted constitution. Number five, establishment of electoral commissions and electoral courts or tribunals. Number six, formation, registration, and recognition of political parties. Number seven, party primaries and campaigns. And then number eight, general elections. All these are the democratic process we have. One by one, this is how we actually observe democracy. This is how we start from the beginning to the situation or to the extent where we change government, which is the last one is general election. One before that is party primaries. So you take it step by step, from one step to another, from one step to the other, from one step to the other, just to arrive at general election. And either you're still the winner when you were ruling, that means you're going back to the office, or these people decide, you know what, we want a new person. So basically that is the process of democracy. Now, since we've looked at that, let us look at the limitation of rule of law. Remember, we say rule of law is a situation where government laws are above everybody. Everybody is beneath the law. You have to consent, you have to conform to the provisions of the law. No matter who you are in the society, you have to respect the law enough not to break it. Now, let us look at some of the limitations of rule of law in Nigeria. Now, of course, the rule of law is faced with certain limitations which circumstances do not allow its holistic application, and these include: number one, imposing state of emergency; number two, military intervention or statocracy; number three, lack of independence of the judiciary; number four, the setting up of special or administrative panels and tribunals; Number 5, incidence of poverty, illiteracy, and ignorance. Number 6, the granting of immunity and discretionary powers to certain government officials. This includes the granting of diplomatic immunity to those in foreign missions. Number 7, the rising spate and unchecked police brutality. Number 8, economic achievements of some capitalists. And number 9, the immunity of the minors or underage children. And then finally, traditions and customs demand. Sometimes rule of law face the basic limitation of the idea that tradition and custom demand that so person should not be tried, so person should not be taken to court, so person should not be arrested. That is one of the limitations, and the rest that we have mentioned are all part of the limitations of rule of law, especially in Nigeria. Now, since we've looked at the limitation, let us head to the importance of rule of law in Nigeria. And some of the importance include: number 1, the rule of law guarantees equality before the law, notwithstanding the social placement of anybody. Number 2, it safeguards one from molestation, brutality, indiscriminate arrest, and coercive oppression. Number 3, it guarantees the practice of fundamental human rights and personal liberties as enshrined or stated in the law. Number 4, the rule of law is opposed to commercialized justice, unfair treatment, and hearing. Number 5, it is opposed to government ruling arbitrarily and without regard to established law. Number 6, the rule of law allows public power to be decentralized in order to avoid the reign of terror and tyranny. Number 7, it is opposed to courts martialing, trials in special courts and tribunals. Number 8, it allows individuals the right to seek redress, compensation, and damages when their rights are infringed upon or violated with impunity. All these are some of the importance of rule of law. Now, what is the process of rule of law? We've seen the process, the democratic process. Now, what is the process of rule of law, especially here in Nigeria? Number 1, some of the processes of rule of law are that all social, economic, political, and legal actions must be guided by law to avoid social frictions. Number 2, that the law so made must pass through accepted legislative procedures before it is enacted or by means of delegated legislation, and that those enacting the law must be duly elected while acting under the mandate and will of the populace so represented. Number 3, that the law can only be rightly interpreted or reviewed by the proper constituted court of the land. Number 4, that the rule of law demands that legislative, adjudicative, and executive functions of government be handled separately by different officials following the doctrine of separation of powers. That's when we say doctrine of separation of powers, we're talking about the guidelines of separation of powers for proper accountability and responsibility in government, business, and public affairs, as supported by the doctrine of check and balances, as supported by the guidelines of check and balances. And then number 5, that all civil and personal grievances that cannot be resolved through the mechanism of alternative to dispute resolution must be resolved through the ordinary court to avoid jungle justice, or one taking the laws into his hand. And then finally, number 6, that every citizen of age has the right to sue or be sued in a court of competent jurisdiction, and that the court, through a properly established law enforcement agency, has the authority to enforce its decision and or judgment which the law sees as binding. When we talk about every citizen who has come of age, we are talking about a citizen who is 18 years and above. Now, these are the processes of rule of law. Now, what are the problems of rule of law? Know that there is a difference between the limitation of rule of law and the problems of rule of law. When we talk about limitation, we're talking about the things that hinder, the things that serves as bans, as fetters from us achieving the rule of law. But when we talk about problems, we're looking at the rule of law and the inconvenience that some of this rule of law or some of the tenets of rule of law would cause. Now, some of the problems of rule of law include: laws give room only for the ideal and often remain indifferent to reality and emotional experiences of people. Number two, laws enacted by bourgeois, democrats, or by democratic oligarchs often stand against the will of the masses. Because the law rules, the masses groan under the yoke of the law and remain enslaved by the law that is supposed to yield freedom. Number three, people suffer recurrent police brutality, unjust court injunctions and prohibitions which often negate work against basic liberties and personal well-being in the name of rule of law. Number four, the delay encountered in legal processes and procedures from its making down to its enforcement frustrates the solving of urgent and emergency problems. And then finally, number five, the last one we're going to take is: law being an ass may be opposed to revolution, generational leap and innovations needed for modernity and rapid developmental needs. All these are problems of rule of law. So basically that's what we have for this video. In the beginning we talked about the meaning, we told the meaning of democracy and rule of law, talked about the advantages of democracy, and we talked about the problems of democracy. Then we talked about the democratic process. Then we went down to limitation of rule of law, importance of rule of law, and we looked at the process of rule of law, and then finally the problems of rule of law. Some questions are going to pop up on your screen right now, and I'm hopeful that you are going to answer them correctly. Till I see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.